September 11, 2001, is a date etched in the memory of Americans and people around the world. It was a day that shook the United States to its core. The attacks that occurred on this day changed the course of history. They altered the way we think about security, terrorism, and global politics. 4 commercial airliners were hijacked by terrorists. They were used as weapons against civilian and military targets. The attacks resulted in the deaths of nearly 3,000 people. The targets were symbols of American power and prosperity. The World Trade Center in New York City represented economic might. The Pentagon in Washington, D.C. stood for military strength. The 4th plane, believed to be headed for the U.S. Capitol or White House, crashed in Pennsylvania. These attacks struck at the heart of America's identity and sense of security. Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization responsible for the 9/11 attacks, did not emerge overnight. Its roots can be traced back to the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. During this conflict, many Arab volunteers joined the Afghan Mujahideen in fighting against Soviet forces. Among these volunteers was Osama bin Laden, a wealthy Saudi who would later become the leader of Al-Qaeda. After the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, bin Laden and other veterans of the conflict formed Al-Qaeda. The group's initial goal was to continue the jihad, or holy war, against what they saw as corrupt and un-Islamic regimes in the Middle East. However, their focus soon shifted to include the United States and its allies. Al-Qaeda's ideology was rooted in a radical interpretation of Islam. They believed in establishing a global Islamic caliphate. They saw the United States as the primary obstacle to this goal. Bin Laden issued a fatwa, or religious decree, in 1998. It called for Muslims to kill Americans and their allies wherever possible. The group carried out several attacks against U.S. targets in the years leading up to 9/11. The morning of September 11, 2001 began like any other day for most Americans. But as the day unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary Tuesday. Eyewitness 1. The first sign of trouble came at 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time. American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. At first, many thought it was a terrible accident. Eyewitness 2. But 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. It became clear that America was under attack. The nation watched in horror as smoke billowed from the Twin Towers. People trapped in the upper floors waved desperately for help. The attacks were not limited to New York. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, a 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, had been hijacked. Passengers on this flight, having learned of the other attacks, decided to fight back. Eyewitness 1. At 9:59 a.m., the unthinkable happened. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed. The collapse of the Twin Towers was a sight that shocked the world. Each tower was 110 stories tall. They had dominated the New York skyline for nearly 3 decades. Now they were reduced to rubble in a matter of seconds. Firefighter. As the towers fell, they created massive clouds of dust and debris. These clouds engulfed Lower Manhattan. People ran for their lives as the debris chased them through the streets. The scene was apocalyptic. The human toll was staggering. Nearly 2,753 people died in the New York attacks alone. This included 343 firefighters and 60 police officers. Many people were trapped in the upper floors of the towers. While the world's attention was focused on New York, another attack was unfolding in Washington, D.C.
At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. The impact caused part of the building to collapse. 184 people died, including 64 on the plane.
Meanwhile, United Airlines Flight 93 met a different fate. Passengers learned about the other attacks through phone calls. They decided to fight back against the hijackers. Their bravery prevented the plane from reaching its target. The plane crashed in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. All 44 people on board died. Their actions saved countless lives on the ground. Their courage became an enduring story of heroism. In the hours following the attacks, the United States was in a state of shock and confusion. President George W. Bush, who had been visiting a school in Florida when the attacks began, was flown to secure locations. He addressed the nation that evening, declaring, "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America."
The immediate focus was on search and rescue efforts, particularly in New York. Thousands of first responders and volunteers rushed to Ground Zero. They worked tirelessly, often at great personal risk, to search for survivors. The last survivor was pulled from the rubble 27 hours after the collapse of the towers. After that, the grim task of recovering bodies began.
Air traffic across the United States was completely shut down for the first time in history. All civilian aircraft were ordered to land at the nearest airport. This unprecedented move left thousands of travelers stranded. The skies over America, usually busy with air traffic, fell eerily silent. Only military aircraft remained airborne. The stock market closed for several days following the attacks. The international community responded to the 9/11's attacks with an outpouring of sympathy and support for the United States.
World leaders condemned the attacks and offered their condolences. Many countries held moments of silence or special memorial services. The French newspaper Le Monde famously ran a headline declaring, "We are all Americans."
NATO invoked Article 5 of its charter for the first time in its history. This article states that an attack on one member nation is an attack on all. This move paved the way for a unified military response against al-Qaeda and its allies.
Countries around the world offered military support to the United States. In the Middle East, reactions were more complex. While many governments and citizens condemned the attacks, there were also instances of celebration in some areas.
These conflicting responses highlighted the complex relationship between the United States and the region. In the wake of the 9/11's attacks, the United States launched the War on Terror.
This campaign aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and preventing future attacks. President Bush declared, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor them."
The first major action came in October 2001. The U.S., with NATO support, launched Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. The Taliban regime was quickly overthrown.
However, the war in Afghanistan continued for nearly 2 decades. It became the longest war in U.S. history. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, citing weapons of mass destruction. These claims were later proven false.
The Iraq War was more controversial than Afghanistan. It led to divisions within the U.S. and among its allies. The 9/11's attacks had a profound and lasting impact on American society and politics.
One of the most visible changes was in airport security. The Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, was created to oversee security in all modes of transportation. Air travel became more time-consuming and intrusive, with new screening procedures and restrictions.
The USA Patriot Act, passed in the wake of the attacks, gave law enforcement agencies expanded surveillance powers. This led to ongoing debates about the balance between security and civil liberties.
The government's use of tactics such as wiretapping and data collection became controversial. These issues continue to be debated today.
The attacks also had a significant impact on American foreign policy. The doctrine of preemptive war, used to justify the Iraq invasion, marked a shift in how the U.S. approached global threats.
The focus on counterterrorism led to increased military spending and interventions in various parts of the world. This approach has been both praised and criticized by different segments of the American public and the international community.
As we look back on the events of September 11, 2001, the impact of that day continues to resonate.
The 9/11's Memorial and Museum now stands at the site of the World Trade Center. It serves as a powerful reminder of the lives lost and the resilience of the American people.
Each year, on the anniversary of the attacks, the names of the victims are read aloud in a solemn ceremony. The legacy of 9/11 is complex and multifaceted.
It changed how Americans view their place in the world and their relationship with their government. It led to 2 long wars and reshaped American foreign policy.
It also sparked important conversations about religious tolerance, civil liberties, and the nature of heroism.
For a generation of Americans, 9/11 is a defining moment in their lives. For those born after 2001, it's a historical event they learn about in school.
But for all Americans, it remains a day of remembrance and reflection. It's a time to honor the victims, the first responders, and all those affected by the attacks.